Primary 5 second midterm English literature. The tide rises, the tide falls. Lesson objectives are to learn a poem which is related to a life cycle of a person and to learn some poetic techniques. You all can turn your book into page 32. Then you can find this poem, The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls. Who is the writer of the poem? Yes, the writer of this poem is Henry Wordsworth Longfellow, or you can use H.W. Longfellow. Let's look at some information about his life. He is an American poet. He was born on 27th of February in 1807 and he died on 24th of March in 1882. He became a professor at Bowdoin and later at Harvard College. And he is most noted for the song of Hiawatha and The Tide Rises, the Tide Falls. So, he wrote many lyric poems and became the most popular American poet of his day. Let's look at the poem. Now, this poem contains 3 stanzas. The first stanza is this. Let's read the first stanza. The tide rises, the tide falls. The twilight darkens, the curlew calls. Along the sea sand, damp and brown, the traveller hastens toward the town. And the tide rises, the tide falls. So, if you look at the first stanza, you can see some words with different colors. So, what do you mean by twilight? Twilight means the soft glowing light. And who is a curlew? Curlew is a big bird. You can see the picture of a curlew also here. And damp means somewhat wet, slightly wet. Hasten means quick to do something. So the tide rises and it falls, and twilight darkness with curlew birds. Along the sea sand, it's damp and brown. The traveller, there is a person, hastens towards the town, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Let's look at the second stanza. Darkness settles on roof and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. The little waves with their soft white hands efface the footprints in the sands, and the tide rises, the tide falls. So, darkness comes to roofs and walls, but the sea in the darkness calls. Even during the night, we can find these tides. Tides rises and tide falls. So, little waves with their soft white hands. It means when waves are appearing, we can find this soft white thing. Efface the footprints in the sand, and the tide rises, the tide falls. Efface means what? Erase from surface. Now, when we are walking along the beach, these we can see footprints, but with the waves, they are erasing those footprints in the sand, and the tide rises and the tide falls. This is the last stanza. The morning breaks, the steeds in their stalls stamp and neigh as the ostler calls. The day returns but nevermore, returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. So, who is a steed? Steed is a horse. So, the morning breaks. Now, during the morning time, we can find these horses in stalls. Stamp and neigh. Neigh means a sound made by a horse. And as the ostler calls, who is an ostler? A person who looks after horses. The day returns, but never more returns the traveler to the shore, and the tide rises, the tide falls. So, we can analyze this poem in a different perspective. So, we can analyze it like this way. This poem is all about the process of birth, death, and rebirth in the world. In the first stanza, it says an old traveler is walking along the seashore at the time of dusk and heading to the town. I think you can remember. In the first stanza, we met that old traveler. And in the second stanza, it describes the way night appears to the shore. How night comes to the shore. Little waves in the sea erase the footprints of the traveler on the shore. And in the last stanza, the poet mentioned about the next day morning, means the rebirth. The horses in the stable are shouting when the ostler calls them. However, the traveler will not come back to the shore again, like the dead will never return. It shows this is how the life goes on in the world. So, first stanza about the old traveler, it means the birth. And the second stanza, we talked about night and how we erase these, how the waves erase these footprints. So, it is like the death of a person. And in the third stanza, we got to know about the morning breaks and how these steeds, it means horses, are making sounds. The morning breaks means the next day. It means it is like the rebirth of a person. So, it's like a life cycle of a person. So, we can look at this poem in that perspective also. Then, we will look at what are the poetic techniques in this poem. Before we come to the poetic techniques, can you remember what do we mean by repetition? Yes, repetition is the repeating of any word or a phrase or a sentence or lines within a poem. It means we can see the same word again and again in the poem. And what do you mean by rhyming words? Rhyme is the matching vowel sounds at the end of words or lines. It means we get the same vowel sound when we read the last word in each line. So, in this poem also we can find these two poetic techniques. The first one is repetition. We can find the repetition of the tide rises, the tide falls. You can see the same word, the tide, tide rises, the tide falls. So, it is repetition. And also we can find rhyming words in the poem. Now, if you look at the last word in each line, you can find these rhyming words. So, falls, calls, brown, town, walls, calls. When we read these words, we get to know the same vowel sound is coming. Falls, calls, alls, brown, town. So, we call this technique as rhyming words. So, mainly there are two poetic techniques in this poem. Now, there is an activity. First question is, who is the writer of the poem? At the beginning of this discussion, we talked about the writer. So, you can find the answer. Second question is, draw the life cycle of a man. So, we discussed about this poem in a different perspective. There we talked about 3 stages. So, you can draw that one, life cycle of a man. Then you need to make sentences using these words: curlew, damp, ostler, steed. So, I hope you learned something from this presentation. Thank you.